Chapter 2, Part 4 of The Princess Aline by Richard Harding Davis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 2, Part 4. On the morning following, Carlton and Mrs. Downs and her niece, with all the tourists in Constantinople, were placed in open carriages by their dragomans, and driven in a long procession to the seraglio to see the Sultan's treasures. Those of them who had waited 2 weeks for this chance looked aggrieved at the more fortunate who had come at the 11th hour of the last night's steamer, and seemed to think these latter had attained the privilege without sufficient effort. The ministers of the different legations, as is the harmless custom of such gentlemen, had impressed everyone for whom they had obtained permission to see the treasures with the great importance of the service rendered, and had succeeded in making everyone feel either especially honoured or especially uncomfortable at having given them so much trouble. This sense of obligation, and the fact that the dragomans had assured the tourists that they were for the time being the guests of the Sultan, awed and depressed most of the visitors to such an extent that their manner in the long procession of carriages suggested a funeral cortege, with the Hohenwalds in front, escorted by beys and pashas as chief mourners. The procession halted at the palace, and the guests of the Sultan were received by numerous effendis in single-button frock-coats and freshly ironed fezzes, who served them with glasses of water and a huge bowl of some sweet stuff, of which everyone was supposed to take a spoonful. There was at first a general fear among the Cook's tourists that there would not be enough of this to go around, which was succeeded by a greater anxiety lest they should be served twice. Some of the tourists put the sweet stuff in their mouths direct, and licked the spoon, and others dropped it off the spoon into the glass of water, and stirred it about and sipped at it, and no one knew who had done the right thing, not even those who happened to have done it. Carlton and Miss Morris went out on the terrace while this ceremony was going forward, and looked out over the great panorama of waters, with the Sea of Marmora on one side, the Golden Horn on the other, and the Bosporus at their feet. The sun was shining mildly, and the waters were stirred by great and little vessels. Before them on the opposite bank rose the dark green cypresses which marked the grim cemetery of England's dead, and behind them were the great turtle-backed mosques and pencil-like minarets of the two cities, and close at hand the mosaic walls and beautiful gardens of Constantinople. "Your friends the Hohenwalds don't seem to know you this morning," she said. "Oh yes, he spoke to me as we left the hotel," Carlton answered. "But they are on parade at present. There are a lot of their countrymen among the tourists." "I feel rather sorry for them," Miss Morris said, looking at the group with an amused smile. "Etiquette cuts them off from so much innocent amusement. Now, you are a gentleman, and the Duke presumably is, and why should you not go over and say, 'Your Highness, I wish you would present me to your sister, whom I am to meet at dinner tomorrow night. I admire her very much.' And then you could point out the historical features to her, and show her where they have finished off a blue and green tiled wall with a rusty tin roof, and make pretty speeches to her. It wouldn't hurt her, and it would do you a lot of good. The simplest way is always the best way, it seems to me." "Oh yes, of course," said Carlton. "Suppose he came over here and said, 'Carlton, I wish you would present me to your young American friend. I admire her very much. I would probably say, 'Do you? Well, you will have to wait until she expresses some desire to meet you.' No, etiquette is all right in itself, only some people don't know its laws, and that is the one instance, to my mind, where ignorance of the law is no excuse." Carlton left Miss Morris talking with the secretary of the American legation and went to look for Mrs. Downs. When he returned he found that the young secretary had apparently asked and obtained permission to present the Duke's equerries and some of his diplomatic confrères, who were standing now about her in an attentive semicircle and pointing out the different palaces and points of interest. Carlton was somewhat disturbed at the sight, and reproached himself with not having presented anyone to her before. He was sure now that she must have had a dull time of it, but he wished, nevertheless, that if she was to meet other men, the secretary had allowed him to act as master of ceremonies. "I suppose you know," that gentleman was saying as Carlton came up, "that when you pass by Abydos, on the way to Athens, you will see where Leander swam the Hellespont to meet Hero. That little white lighthouse is called Leander in honor of him. It makes rather an interesting contrast, does it not, to think of that chap swimming along in the dark, and then to find that his monument today is a lighthouse, with revolving lamps and electric appliances, and with ocean tramps and bridges and men of war around it. We have improved in our mechanism since then," he said, with an air. "But I am afraid the men of to-day don't do that sort of thing for the women of to-day." "Then it is the men who have deteriorated," said one of the equerries, bowing to Miss Morris. "It is certainly not the women." The two Americans looked at Miss Morris to see how she received this, but she smiled good-naturedly. "I know a man who did more than that for a woman," said Carlton, innocently. "He crossed an ocean and several countries to meet her, and he hasn't met her yet." Miss Morris looked at him and laughed, in the safety that no one understood him but herself. "But he ran no danger," she answered. "He didn't, did he?" said Carlton, looking at her closely and laughing. "I think he was in very great danger all the time." "Shocking!" said Miss Morris, reprovingly, "and in her very presence, too." She knitted her brows and frowned at him. "I really believe if you were in prison you would make pretty speeches to the jailer's daughter." "Yes," said Carlton, boldly, "or even to a woman who was a prisoner herself." "I don't know what you mean," she said, turning away from him to the others. "How far was it that Leander swam?" she asked. The English captain pointed out 2 spots on either bank, and said that the shores of Abydos were a little over that distance apart. "As far as that?" said Miss Morris. "How much he must have cared for her!" She turned to Carlton for an answer. "I beg your pardon?" he said. He was measuring the distance between the 2 points with his eyes. "I said how much he must have cared for her. You wouldn't swim that far for a girl." "For a girl!" laughed Carlton, quickly. "I was just thinking I would do it for $50. The English captain gave a hasty glance at the distance he had pointed out, and then turned to Carlton. "I'll take you," he said seriously. "I bet you £20 you can't do it." There was an easy laugh at Carlton's expense, but he only shook his head and smiled. "Leave him alone, Captain," said the American secretary. "It seems to me I remember a story of Mr. Carlton's swimming out from Navesink to meet an ocean liner. It was about 3 miles, and the ocean was rather rough, And when they slowed up, he asked them if it was raining in London when they left. They thought he was mad." "Is that true, Carlton?" asked the Englishman. "Something like it," said the American, "except that I didn't ask them if it was raining in London. I asked them for a drink, and it was they who were mad. They thought I was drowning, and slowed up to lower a boat, and when they found out I was just swimming around, they were naturally angry." "Well, I'm glad you didn't bet with me," said the captain, with a relieved laugh. That evening, as the Englishman was leaving the smoking room, and after he had bidden Carlton good night, he turned back and said, "I didn't like to ask you before those men this morning, but there was something about your swimming adventure I wanted to know. Did you get that drink?" "I did," said Carlton, "in a bottle. They nearly broke my shoulder." As Carlton came into the breakfast-room on the morning of the day he was to meet the Princess Aline at dinner, Miss Morris was there alone, and he sat down at the same table, opposite to her. She looked at him critically and smiled with evident amusement. "Today," she quoted solemnly, "the birthday of my life has come." Carlton poured out his coffee with a shake of his head and frowned. "Oh, you can laugh," he said, "but I didn't sleep at all last night. I lay awake making speeches to her. I know they are going to put me between the wrong sisters," he complained, "or next to one of those old ladies in waiting, or whatever they are." "How are you going to begin?" said Miss Morris. "Will you tell her you have followed her from London, or from New York rather, that you are a young Lochnivar who came out of the West and—" "I don't know," said Carlton meditatively, "just how I shall begin, but I know the curtain is going to rise promptly at 8 o'clock, about the time the soup comes on, I think. I don't see how she can help but be impressed a little bit. It isn't every day a man hurries around the globe on account of a girl's photograph, and she is beautiful, isn't she?" Miss Morris nodded her head encouragingly. "Do you know sometimes," said Carlton, glancing over his shoulders to see if the waiters were out of hearing, "I fancy she has noticed me. Once or twice I have turned my head in her direction without meaning to, and found her looking. Well, looking my way at least. Don't you think that is a good sign?" he asked eagerly. "It depends on what you call a good sign," said Miss Morris judicially. "It is a sign you're good to look at, if that's what you want. But you probably know that already, and it's not to your credit. It certainly isn't a sign that a person cares for you because she prefers to look at your profile rather than at what the dragomans are trying to show her." Carlton drew himself up stiffly. "If you knew your Alice better," he said with severity, "you would understand that it is not polite to make personal remarks. I ask you, as my confidant, if you think she has noticed me, and you make fun of my looks. That's not the part of a confidant." "Noticed you?" laughed Miss Morris scornfully. "How could she help it? You are always in the way. You are at the door whenever they go out or come in, and when we are visiting mosques and palaces, you are invariably looking at her instead of the tombs and things, with a wistful far-away look, as though you saw a vision. The first time you did it, after you had turned away, I saw her feel to see if her hair was all right. You quite embarrassed her." "I didn't. I don't," stammered Carlton, indignantly. "I wouldn't be so rude. Oh, I see I'll have to get another confidant. You are most unsympathetic and unkind." But Miss Morris showed her sympathy later in the day, when Carlton needed it sorely. For the dinner towards which he had looked with such pleasurable anticipations and lover-like misgivings did not take place. The Sultan, so the equerry informed him, had, with Oriental unexpectedness, invited the Duke to dine that night at the palace, and the Duke, much to his expressed regret, had been forced to accept what was in the nature of a command. He sent word by his equerry, however, that the dinner to Mr. Carlton was only a pleasure deferred, and that at Athens, where he understood Carlton was also going, he hoped to have the pleasure of entertaining him and making him known to his sisters. "He is a selfish young egoist," said Carlton to Mrs. Downs. "As if I cared whether he was at the dinner or not! Why wouldn't he have fixed it so I might have dined with his sisters alone? We would never have missed him. I'll never meet her now. I know it. I feel it. Fate is against me. Now I will have to follow them on to Athens, and something will turn up there to keep me away from her. You'll see, you'll see. I wonder where they go from Athens." The Hohenwalds departed the next morning, and as their party had engaged all the staterooms in the little Italian steamer, Carlton was forced to wait over for the next. He was very gloomy over this disappointment, and Miss Morris did her best to amuse him. She and her aunt were never idle now, and spent the last few days of their stay in Constantinople in the bazaars or in excursions up and down the river. "These are my last days of freedom,"
of The Princess
Miss Morris
Aline
said
by
to
Richard
him
Harding
once.
Davis,
And I
this
mean to make
Librivox
the most
recording
of
is
them.
in the public domain.
After this, recording
there
by
will be no
Carolyn.
more travelling for
Chapter
me.
2, Part
and
4.
I love it so, she
On
added
the morning
wistfully.
following, Carlton and Mrs.
Carlton made
Downs
no
and her
comment,
niece,
but he felt
with
a certain
all the
contemptuous
tourists in
pity for the young
Constantinople,
man in
were
America
placed in
who had
open
required
carriages by
such
their
a
dragomans,
sacrifice.
and
She
driven
is
in a
too
long
nice a
procession
girl
to the
to let him know
seraglio
she is
to see
making
the
a
Sultan's
sacrifice,
treasures.
he thought.
Those
giving
of
up
them who had
anything for
waited
him,
2 weeks
but
for this
she won't
chance
forget it.
looked aggrieved
And
at the more
Carlton again
fortunate
commended
who had come at
himself
the 11th
for not
hour
having
of the
asked
last night's
any woman to
steamer,
make any
and seemed to
sacrifices
think
for
these latter
him.
had attained the privilege without
End of
sufficient
chapter 2,
effort.
part 4.
The ministers of the different legations, as is the harmless custom of such gentlemen, had impressed everyone for whom they had obtained permission to see the treasures with the great importance